today I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Robert Miller. He's currently back in Tennessee, where he plans for the Division of Radiation Oncology to focus on disparities in research in our Appalachian patient population. He joined the faculty of the Department of Radiation Oncology at the Mayo Clinic in 1998 and retired from Mayo Clinic in 2019 with the rank of professor. During his time there, he led 5 practice-changing multi-institutional cooperative group phase 3 trials funded by the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Robert Miller was also instrumental in developing Mayo Clinic's particle therapy program as vice chair for research in radiation oncology and later as the medical director for the particle therapy program. So once again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Miller to be our first speaker of the Spring STEM series events.
Thanks, everybody. It's very kind. I'm going to go kind of quick today. I was talking to Ms. Bolton earlier, and she wanted me to put something in about my own career path to serve as an example. So I just pasted a whole bunch of slides back in that I'll try to make up time for. So my career is very much tied to the Tennessee River Valley and Oak Ridge National Laboratories. My parents brought me down from Kentucky summer of 1972 and took me to the Atomic Energy Museum, which is now the Science Center there. So made a big impression on me, but I came from a family where people didn't go into the professions. My parents both went to Berea College, which you probably know, liberal arts college just up the road for children without resources from the Appalachians, and made it a focus for me to go to college. We ended up in Oklahoma, and I went to the University of Tulsa, another pretty small school, focused on petroleum engineering, and I was studying engineering physics. That was my bachelor's. I took no biology, took just probably 2 chemistry classes. Never thought about being a doctor. But my senior year, my high school sweetheart, who was no longer, we weren't really together, but we were good friends at that point, came down with a form of cancer called Hodgkin's lymphoma and required radiation treatment to get cured. It was pretty rough. And so that had a big impact on me. So I'd never thought about being a doctor, but decided that's what I wanted to do. And went back to Kentucky and enrolled in graduate school. So I didn't have any pre-meds, but I did end up with about 64 hours of undergraduate physics, and much of it focused on physics of the atom and engineering projects, and then also business management tossed in there too. And that's a very TVA kind of thing. Big engineering is part of the culture of this region. My first job in healthcare was as the emergency medical technician in Casey County, Kentucky. That's just north of Lake Cumberland, and went to community college at night and got certified as an EMT while I was in graduate school, and planned to go to medical school, and also thought I would spend my whole career at this point working in this building right here, and that's the Markey Cancer Center, Lexington. That obviously didn't come to pass. I was working in the radiation biology laboratory. I kind of started at the bottom in the hospital at an entry-level job, and while I was going to graduate school and worked all the time in my mid-20s. Eventually ended up kind of as a helper in the radiation biology laboratory, and a young woman from Harlan, Kentucky walked in because they were out of liquid nitrogen downstairs. And 29 years later, she's my wife, and we ended up packing up and leaving Kentucky 27 years ago. And because of all the physics I had, I was able to get a good residency slot at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So went on to have a career there, focused a lot on drugs that mitigate radiation damage. And since 9/11, that's been a big focus in this country. What the government would like is us to find drugs that can be used in national emergencies or sort of warfighting scenarios. And if we get those in the clinic where there's a pipeline of drugs, it'll be better for the country than trying to have to buy these and stockpile these. So that was actually a lot of what I did, and enjoyed that, but moved on from that. Also built buildings for Mayo. If you know St. Olaf, another liberal arts college, I built a cancer center on their campus. It's kind of a unique thing, probably America's only liberal arts college with its own cancer center. Then got involved in building really big things and particle accelerator facilities for medical uses. This is the big concrete pour in Rochester, Minnesota. You need a lot of concrete for radiation shielding. This is the Jacobson building, about $85 million, I think, went into this big project. There's a generous patient from Iowa who's been a Mayo Clinic patient since the time of the Mayo brothers. Actually, he was about 5 years old, and his parents brought him up to get treated. He, in the 1950s, realized where the interstate systems were going to cross was going to be a really big deal for warehouses, and so he built big warehouses. Made a lot of money and gave us a $100 million gift to build this building. So what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is some of the basic science behind how can we use radiation and how can we use particles to treat cancer. So most medical radiation done in America and around the developed world is done with something called photons, which many of you probably know are electromagnetic waves. They're photons with millions of electron volts energy. And everybody knows about X-rays. The X-rays pass through your body and they leave an image on some film. Now, you can use that for medical purposes by directing at areas where cancer is, but because photons weakly interact with matter, it leaves damage both before the tumor and then on the other side of the tumor. So this is a representation here of DNA that would be in a cell or maybe in a tumor. And when a photon beam comes through, it lightly ionizes the fluid in the cells. So it creates ionization and excitation of molecules in the water. Typically, it doesn't directly damage the DNA, but what happens is you have these reactive species like hydrogen peroxide can then drift around and eventually they bump into the DNA perhaps. Actually, most of them don't, but enough do that it damages the DNA so that when the cell tries to divide, it dies. And so that's how medical radiation works, primarily through something called the Compton effect. This is what sadly was the focus of my mid-20s, this equation right here. Now we can also accelerate particles. And so photons have no mass. They're electromagnetic wave. That's why they weakly interact. If you have something with mass like an electron or the constituent of an atom or even an atom itself, it'll go a certain distance and stop with different degrees of reliability. So one of the things that we've been interested in using these particle accelerators is, can you direct it at the tumor so that it goes up to the tumor but doesn't go too much far past it? So electrons are pretty light. They weigh about 1/2000th of the weight of a proton or neutron. And so this is a representation of a beam coming into matter. And these are kind of individual tracks. So electrons will go in and stop, but it's pretty fuzzy if I was using that in the human body. Protons are better. They'll go in a pretty discrete distance and stop. You can see a couple little outliers here. That's where the proton might collide actually with the atom. And then if you have something really heavy like carbon or iron, it creates a really sharply focused beam, but you need really big magnets and a lot of money to have carbon beam. So the Coulomb, the Compton effect was in my 20s. In my 30s and 40s, it was more about protons than matter. And so you can create an accelerator, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to accelerate protons to really high energy and then fire those carefully into people's bodies. Because protons have mass and charge, the proton has a positive charge. When it comes into sort of the orbit of an atom, you can kick an electron off with different amounts of energy that can create ionization and excitation and damage tumors. And because you can aim it more precisely, you can either give a lower dose or you can miss entirely the good cells. There's some other things that can happen. The last big Coulomb scattering doesn't matter so much. There are sort of, if you imagine playing pool, where your proton actually strikes the nucleus, it can pop things out, create a lot of ionization, but also creates neutrons, which are very carcinogenic. These are the bad things. These are all, neutrons are also really bad for things like pacemakers that have semiconductors in them. So this was the equation sort of for my middle-aged life. And up here on the left, the Bethe-Bloch formula, so change in energy over change in distance. So if you have a particle, how much energy does it lose? And that's sort of your payload, is a negative function of the density of the medium we're going through. What's the density of the electron cloud? And this is what makes it all work. It's a function of the inverse square of velocity. And so what that means is if your proton's moving really fast, and our protons are moving really, really fast, it's like skipping a stone over a pond. And so if you imagine that stone hits the surface, and it bleeds a little energy and it skips and it bleeds a little more and it skips and it skips and it skips. And then at the end of its range, it just drops and you get a big splash. And my animation's kind of broke on this slide, but if you look here, here's some parallel proton beams coming in. You can see sort of light ionization, and at the very end of their range, they drop all of their energy. So if we imagine a person or tissue, this green block is a person, and here's the photons that we talked about earlier that lightly ionize. Most of the photons actually go right through the patient and out the other side. What happens is it's really intense where they come in the body, and then the dose drops. And so if your tumor's down here, you actually have to give a lot more dose before the tumor rather than at the tumor. It's the opposite for protons. None of them exit, and you get a little bit of ionization and then a big peak, it's called the Bragg peak, right at the end of their range. And so what you can do is create different patterns or fluences or depths or doses by combining these little beams. And here's a representation in space. So this is a three-dimensional array of these little balls, and you can stack these layers up and sort of cover volumes in people's body. So what do we do with this medically? So this is a patient I treated last year. These are axial images from CAT scans. It's like a salami slice through the pelvis. And this right here is the head of the left femur. Here's the pelvis bones. This is the rectum. Here's the prostate. You look over here, this bone is intact. You see this nice little white line around it. It shows the cortex.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but can you pause for a second?
Yep.
We are actually looking at, we are not seeing the display of we are seeing your slides, but we're seeing them in the preview version rather than in the, and so when you're pointing, we're not seeing where you're pointing.
Ah, thank you. How can I fix it? How about that?
Ah, that's better.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry. Don't ever hesitate to speak up. So over here, this bone is intact. And if you look here, you see this bone is disrupted. In this red here is the malignant tumor. It's spread from another organ in the body. It's the only site of disease that's active. And this patient's already had high doses of radiation with photons. That damages the small vessels. It's a bit like aging prematurely. And if we give more radiation, it came back and affected the rectum, anal canal, or prostate, it caused sort of permanent injury. So what we can do is bring in a couple proton beams though, and just surround this area. Still gets a high dose back here, but the dose doesn't go further into this irradiated tissue. This is kind of a best case scenario here for its use. The other thing we did, and this is getting a little off the topic, is you can use heat to kind of mess with the biological repair processes going on in the tumor. So we have a device, uses microwaves. It warms up patients, not that much, like 107 degrees on the inside. We can actually focus it on the tumor. That triggers some cellular processes involving heat shock proteins. And all human cells and most tumors have ways they can repair radiation damage. We live in an environment where we're bathed in radiation naturally. And so any complex organism on this earth has sort of biochemical processes that can heal some radiation damage. Not all of it, but a little bit. And those heat shock proteins kind of cross those pathways. So if we mess with the heat shock proteins, we can actually interfere with the ability of the tumor to repair itself. And then getting even more esoteric, and we don't quite even understand how this works, we could also create sort of these thin sort of cylinders of very, very high dose radiation. And if we get a single shot of that, it does enough damage in some way to trigger the immune system. So by definition, if you have a tumor growing, it's overcome your immune system. And this can help fire it back up, probably by exposing some antigens in there in some way that we don't know. And so one thing about this career path, and it's a pretty unusual career path, you get to combine all this together, medicine, biology, physics, on a daily basis. And go. So this is a schematic of what the facility looks like. This is actually the Mayo facility, not the one I ran in Maryland. They have a synchrotron. There's two different types of accelerators, and here's a beam line. These magnets stand about chest high. I'll give you some idea of the scale. Just these little ones right here. These gantries are a bit smaller. Most gantries, my old gantries, are about 3 stories tall. So you need a big building to put these in. Here's my cyclotron, and the fact that I'm standing there taking a selfie is a really bad sign. It's got a pressure leak, like pop the top. And generally can't go in there because it's radioactive. So this is 90 tons. And this looks pretty, Star Wars, but we'll come back to this in a second. This is actually not terribly advanced technology. The control systems are advanced, but the base technology is not that much past steamships. So early 20th century physics, if you're into physics, it was a really exciting time. People with very, very primitive tools figured out some pretty amazing physics. And so early on, people started making particle accelerators that were linear. You can create sort of these alternating magnetic waves, and you can sort of surf particles down them. For people my generation, if you remember the old Frankenstein laboratory movies, were the Van der Graaf generators and whatnot. So I don't know if Lorenz himself figured this out, but he figured out that you don't need to do it linear. You could have 2 magnets. You can alternate this current and create kind of an infinite runway for these. Well, maybe not infinite, but much longer than a linear runway for these particles. So if you imagine an ice skater pulling their arms in, or this gentleman swinging this hammer here in a circle, you can get these particles moving really, really fast and energetic. And so here's the cyclotron. This thing right here is the beam line, and this is a vacuum. It's only a couple inches across, and they come out of here kind of like a fire hose. A synchrotron, you can dial the energy. Cyclotron, they all come out, and then you have to, this little thing goes in and out to sort of select the energy. And here's a schematic. This is not my facility, but it's a real similar one in Switzerland. This is a cyclotron. Beam comes out here, and then everywhere you want to make a turn, you got to have a magnet, a pretty powerful magnet. And then they make this turn, and then they go down here, and we'll see in the next picture, you have little kicker magnets that can direct the beam into treatment rooms. And so here's sort of the schematic of one of those gantries. It's a bit like a crane that's shaped like a drum. Here's my beam line in Maryland. These are the magnets that direct it. And when they come racing down this pipe here, they're moving at 2/3 of the speed of light. Actually, they're moving really fast. And that's fast enough that relativistic effects take place. And it doesn't really do anything. And obviously protons aren't sentient, so they don't really know they're relativistic. But if they could look out and see us, we'd be moving noticeably slower. And then what's even cooler is when they strike the tumor, they come back into our time reference frame, which is not what I thought I'd be doing when I was a kid. And I'm not telling you any of the headaches or hard parts of this. This is like running a ship or a submarine or something. Here's some of the magnets, and then just right here, the reason you can keep control of these things when they're racing at 2/3 the speed of light is just very powerful magnetics, opposed north and south, and it goes right down the middle there. Here's a gantry, and this doesn't have the magnets in it, but beam line comes in here, and then the magnets bend. You need really powerful magnets, and then it goes down there. And this whole thing can spin 360 degrees with about a 1 millimeter tolerance. If you look right here, you can see this platform and ladder that'll give you an idea of the scale. This is what it looks like on the business end that patients see. It's me and my nurse. And again, the fact that we're taking this picture is a bad thing because it's broke again. And it's often broke. This is what a clinic looks like. This is Mayo Clinic Rochester facility. And real important thing we're going to talk about in a second is the treatment of children. And so we actually have a pediatric anesthesia induction and recovery. And so very, very complex medicine in that many of the young children have to have anesthesia to tolerate the treatment. So every morning you're going through that. And then we had COVID-19 with all the respiratory precautions. It's been a very, very difficult year in a lot of ways. And then here are the treatment rooms, and you can see the shielding concrete. This is what it looks like day to day. A couple of my therapists, Brittany, Dina, they're on the pediatric gantry here. This is actually a fire drill. That's not a real patient. That's just a dummy. You got to think about everything. What if you have a fire in the building and somebody's being treated and they're under anesthetic? How do you get everybody together as a team to get this patient safely out the door? Well, you're also simultaneously kind of recovering them from anesthesia. So you have to do fire drills twice a year. This is my old facility. It's about $233 million in terms of base capital and building costs. That's not including the finance charges. And if you're into Japanese culture, you should be jealous because I have my own cherry blossom grove right across the street, which is very nice. So all that sounds futuristic, but it's actually not that new. And so this technology is almost 100 years old. The first proposal to use protons came in 1946. We might have used them in humans before the Second World War, if the Second World War hadn't happened. The war did accelerate a lot of nuclear technology. The problem here is we didn't have computerized control systems. And so this was something that really didn't take off until late 1990s and the 2000s. There is a theory of technological innovation that looks at technology like evolutionary sort of biology. If you think about Charles Darwin, in the Galapagos, you had different sort of bird lineages growing up on different islands in very different ways. And if somehow one bird got from one island to another, it could take things in a totally different direction. So when I started my career, we actually had these big crayons. We had x-rays, and when we aimed things, we actually just took x-rays of people with these measurements, and we drew on them with crayons and cast lead blocks. Things got a little bit more advanced with the mechanics improving by around the year 2000, but the machines that we used had really reached their limits. And the same thing was true with protons. We've been able to make these accelerators for 50 years, but using them safely is only a recent development. And the reason for that is some things jumped completely from one medical discipline to the other. And diagnostic radiology is pretty similar to what I do, but it's different. And so a couple things happen. Really efficient processors, flash memory, computer speed really went up, so we can handle big data sets and imagery. And then we could tie all that together, and it allows us to actually aim things safely. Pick up the speed here. So here's another representation of, this is a cross-section of a patient. This is a tumor in their pancreas. On the right here is photons, and you can see these blue things show where the path comes in, and you have sort of excess radiation here. Here's a couple proton beams, and you can see you can focus, you miss the valves, and don't have as much nausea this way. Protons are the best treatment for pediatric malignancies. Pediatric malignancies are fortunately very rare things, but the effects of treatment are devastating in children. And so it's very difficult. Pediatric oncology is a small subset. There aren't a lot of people that can do it. I treated children, but I'm not a pediatric oncologist. This is what causes the problems with conventional therapy. And when you expose young people to radiation, they're more sensitive to adults, and they also have longer time to live on average to express that damage. This is a bit mathematical, but if you look here, you see 0 to 30. It's kind of small print. So that's years, and then here's cumulative incidence. And what this is the incidence of cardiac disease in people that have had chest radiation as children. So people have had conventional medical radiation to cure their cancers, but the beam passes through their heart. And if you have a brain tumor like a medulloblastoma, when they aim the radiation at the spinal cord, it exits through the heart. Without treatment, it's a fatal tumor, but the side effects can be devastating. And so if you look here, This is incidence of heart disease. If you didn't have radiation, it's about 4% in these groups of people. But if you had high dose radiation through the heart, by the time you're up into your late 30s, mid 40s, you got about a 1 in 4 chance of having symptomatic heart disease. And so these are the negatives of conventional therapy that we can reduce with protons. That goes to 0 basically with protons for medulloblastoma. Protons are good for children. Again, it's not a big medical indication. Just a couple things about the economics of this. People have built these now all over the United States. I think there's at least 34, 37 under operation. It's been a very difficult business to operate in. And what I did was I put this map together yesterday. Wherever you see the red symbol, these centers have either gone bankrupt or had to substantially restructure their debt. And so as you can see, it's not good odds if you're in this as a business. Mayo Clinic, MD Anderson, places that have big multimodality cancer centers are the ones that perform best, that have a market and fit this into sort of a larger medical practice. So to sum things up on protons, the challenges, the reason those places went bankrupt is there was a center that opened in California about 30 years ago that treated largely prostate cancer, treated a very high volume of patients. But what we found over the years is it's not really a good treatment choice for that. And insurance has not been paying it. Good news is this technology is now being used for more complex things like head and neck cancers that have come back after they've been irradiated. That slows down your treatment and decreases revenues. And so that's what's caused the problem with financial failures. What the field needs is more clinical trials and better evidence to support its use. And so that's where we're at, as we're trying to figure out what it's used for. If you look at technologies like cell phones, they're always unattractive at first. And so that's where we're at with proton technology. In theory, it's going to get cheaper. But to advance the science, if it is going to work, you have to accept a lower financial performance. And if you look at refrigerators were actually invented as medical devices in the late 19th century. And at the time, it was the most expensive sort of medical device you could buy for your hospital. And now, obviously, everybody has them in their home and their office. So that's a bit about protons. I'd like to talk just a little bit about what I hope to do in Tennessee, which is a little bit different. And I was hoping to have an in-person sort of summer research mentorship program. And I got way too optimistic about the vaccine rollout. So I'm pretty disappointed because I like having students around. So what I would like to offer, and I need to put the paperwork together, is there would be an opportunity to work virtually for a couple people on a research project if you're interested, and I'll run that through your advisors first, obviously. One of the things I did when I came here, I kind of shifted gears. I'm no longer involved in particle therapy. I'm interested in what are the really sort of difficult problems in healthcare and how do we address them. And so if you look at this map, this is cancer mortality from 1980 to 2014. Oh, where'd my pointer go? And it shows changes in mortality that have diverged in our country over the last 35 years. And so blue is really good and dark red is really bad. And so what you see are in places like Fairfax, Virginia, New York City, Naples, Florida, Nashville, where you have big cities. Cancer mortality has dropped. It's gone the opposite direction in places like my home, Eastern Kentucky. I also practice cancer medicine in the Mississippi Delta, Greenville and Clarksdale. So there's been a big divergence in this country for a number of things: insurance, education, social fragmentation, race. These are all social determinants of healthcare. I'm not going to solve those problems, but it is important to recognize the impact that they're having. The other thing that's going on, and more impacts sort of my day-to-day life, is America is getting older. And as we get older, there's going to be more and more cancer. It's going to turn around in a couple of decades, but as the baby boomer generation ages, we're seeing an increase in cancer. Second thing that's going on is you may have heard about the epidemic in type 2 diabetes, and America's getting sicker also, and different parts of the country are getting sicker at different rates. One of the most important things that determines how expensive it is to take care of cancer is whether or not that person is sick with other illnesses. Do they have liver disease or kidney failure or problems like that? It's a huge driver of cost. And so what's coming down the road here is, as our government looks to say, how do we take care of people on Medicare, those Medicare cancer costs are going to start to climb significantly. And so one of the things I want to think about for the last few years of my career is how can we address that? Are there ways to more efficiently deliver value-based care? This is something I just published with a young man who's only a couple years older than you. He's a PGY1, he's a first-year intern. And he's from Hawaii. He's pretty passionate about Hawaiian culture and his family. And like me, he's got a personal story that brought him into this. But we wrote this paper on Hawaiian and Pacific Islander cancer disparities. It's going to come out this month in the Journal of Clinical Oncology's Oncology Practice journal. They liked it so much they put it on the cover. But the problems that are faced by Pacific Islanders are pretty similar to the problems we have in Appalachia, actually. And that is access to care, again, fragmentation of the social system, lack of insurance, although that's gotten a little bit better lately, education, wealth. So we're going to write another paper and do the same thing, but look at Appalachia instead. And so for the research project, what we're going to do is take about 6 weeks and hopefully work with a couple students in Kakoa. And we'll just do a big literature review about where things stand currently with cancer health disparities in Appalachia. And have maybe 1 hour a week Zoom lecture. And all this would be pretty flexible, and you could do it from wherever you live. And hopefully 2 to 3 students. I still got to put everything together. Any questions?
I had a question actually.
Yeah.
About the proton treatment. Is that like the average way radiation treatment happens, or did you say that there was a difference?
Yeah, so photon radiation is about 98% of all the treatments given. The danger here for me when I've done this every day for the last 30 years is I don't think to explain the basics, so thank you for your question. So 98% are photons, about 2% currently are protons, and most people come for about a 4 to 6 week course of sort of daily treatment, often given it along with chemotherapy. We got a big crowd here. Somebody's got to have a question.
You said one of the main limiting factors right now is the technology isn't extremely efficient, especially financially. How do you see it? You said it would become more efficient in the future. In what ways are we seeing that right now, or is that something we're not even sure about right now?
Great question. So the first generation of centers are very much one-offs. There's not a lot of standardization. If you look at the automobile industry in America, like 1912, there were like 300 automobile companies. Every city had an automobile, and when you bought a car, you went down there and they, built this car for you. So that's kind of how these proton centers are. There's not standard operating procedures. So over the coming decades, and in theory, there'll be some convergence and standardization that will help reliability. They can make them smaller now, and so you don't have to build these giant sort of $200 million facilities. It's as cheap as 30 to 50 million, although your patient throughput's a lot lower. And so many of the things in healthcare have lagged behind the rest of the country in terms of technological innovation. I mean, we hear a lot about the discoveries, but the infrastructure, the sort of industrial processes, and to some extent, informatics, we haven't seen those gains yet. So that's a good question. Buildings cost about the same, can't make those cheaper. People cost about the same. So there's limits to how much cheaper it can get.
Dr. Miller, I think I understood you to say that they're starting to sort of realize that proton therapy is maybe not especially effective for prostate cancer. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Can you elaborate a little bit on why prostate cancer may not be effectively treated by that modality?
Yeah, we could talk all day on this one. So about 50% of patients treated have received treatment for prostate cancer. So it's not going to be any worse than photons, but if the organ that's most likely to be damaged is in direct contact with the target, it's not pinpoint enough to miss it. And so in prostate cancer, that's the wall of the rectum, the anterior wall of the rectum. And there are, I don't have enough time to talk about sort of the subtleties of what really makes this difficult, but there are uncertainties in beam delivery where things that are close into the primary target don't get spared. It's really the things that are just a little bit away, depending on the anatomy. If you talk to people that are in the industry, they're going to have a different opinion about it, as you might imagine. But in terms of the science, high-level science simply isn't there.
Thank you.
That actually reminded me of another question I had. Sometime like near the middle, you mentioned the rates of heart disease from one treatment. What was the treatment? I think I missed that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I told you it was something different than it was labeled on the slide. Those were survivors of childhood Hodgkin's lymphoma. So young people, under the age of 15, that got high doses of traditional medical radiation. And so generally, that goes right through your chest, front to back. In the old days, it's way safer now. So I don't want to alarm anybody if you have to get it. But this is what was going on in the 1970s.
And the traditional is the proton radiation rather than the photon treatment.
So sorry, it's the opposite. So unfortunately, they sound the same. So photon, I think I was rushing too quick. Photon is the traditional. That's done with the sort of the weakly ionizing things that go right through you.
Right.
I think once again, I would like to highlight a lot of my job is making sure that you students understand the different types of internships that are out there and the different ways that you can get involved one way or the other. And this is a really good opportunity to focus, on an area that a lot of us come from, that he mentioned, flexibility and when you would meet and what you would learn and who you would be working with. And so when you're thinking of those opportunities that you really think I would like to get involved with something, this is a pretty good way to jump into something that impacts a lot of the people that you know very locally.
I have a question. How would we get involved with the internship this summer?
I'll send a description and what we would want for an application to your faculty advisors, and then I assume Lindsay can distribute it to the STEM group. And basically, I just would like to get a personal statement, what motivates you, and what do you want to do with your life, and then your resume. And then I got a couple people here. We'll sit down with them and decide what would be the best fit.
Okay, thank you.
I have a bit of a question about, it's a path question, but not exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So if I remember right, your undergraduate degree was not biology, correct?
Correct.
It was more engineering oriented, correct? So what's very interesting to me about when I see presentations about medicine and medical technology is when I see a proton beam, this setup that you have, I see there must have been physicists involved, there must have been engineers involved, there were computer scientists involved in writing the code that runs the drivers or whatever. And so over the course of one's career, are you having to, how much of that do you need to know or just be conversant in? Or how does that work in a team setting? Can you talk a little bit about how all those pieces move? That's very intriguing to me, how all those pieces get to work together.
Yeah, so I had a team, and so I had about 8 PhD level physicists that are specialized in accelerator physics. They're general medical physicists who then either learned on the job or did residencies in proton physics. And so for the accelerator, the general rule is, or did I have 10 of them? I lost track. They were always getting new jobs because you can make a lot of money going to work for somebody else. But 2 physicists for the accelerator, then 2 for each gantry. And then there are people called dosimetrists that are bachelor's level that do the calculations. My job in the medical side is to assess the medical situation and then delineate targets. And then it's very, very, very mathematical. It's also very difficult to, and so the dosimetrists are the ones that put those plans together, and the physicists have to do the quality and safety and make sure the plans work in real life. And then I had a nursing team, I had a big research team for clinical research. We had one informatics person that we lost. That was a big need. The university couldn't really just supply on a run-of-the-mill basis. But you're correct, it takes a lot of things. To lead, it's important that you know a little bit of all of it. So that's where my physics background got me into that role.
And so you talked about say that word again.
Dosimetrists.
Dosimetrists and the physicists, do they have to do their work for every individual patient? That's an individual project every time.
Yeah, yes, every treatment plan, the human body. So we talk about all these nice little blocks and arrows and everything, but the reality is human bodies breathe and they get pneumonia and it's all this stuff that can go on. And so it's very individualized and intense. And then they work at night a lot to do the quality assurance, and every plan has to be tested to make certain that, because everything's driven by the computer, you have to be certain the computer, because computer controls the beam and everything. A great question.
I want to tag on to that. I'm so intrigued by how this inherently very interdisciplinary field of medicine that you are an expert in is also needing to overlap in a much broader level when you think about rolling out treatments to a community or a population or a nation, and how you've got the social determinants, politics, economics, business, all of that tying in to how we move from taking this technology that has been developed from hours and hours and hours of really smart people plugging away at their physics and biology to the nation. And so it's I really appreciate you talking about those factors, and always a good plug for the liberal arts and for you guys to pay attention in those core classes, because it doesn't operate in a bubble.
Yeah. At the beginning of my career, I was very focused on technical excellence, but the longer it goes, the bigger questions are what you think about at night. I came from West Baltimore. I don't know if anybody is familiar. That's where I practiced the last year and a half. So it's a very difficult urban environment. We didn't lose the sound, did we?
No. Thank you so much, and for all of the knowledge that you've shared with us. I really, again, another plug for these internship opportunities that exist out there. If we seem to be sort of, oh, that exists or this exists, but I might not be good at that, or that might not be something I could do. But really, this is a great talk that shows how much of a team comes together to then build something and learn from each other. And so we were really thankful to have you and have you present that for us.
Well, thanks.
So thank you for taking this chunk of your day out to make sure that we were able to really learn a lot in this short period of time about how much goes into all of those different things.
Thank you. Now I got to go back to real life.
Yeah, us too. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.